Hello, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speakers Series. We are thrilled to have our first speaker in 2023, Dr. Kaufman. She will discuss the underlying root of anti-Semitism and why it happens. In addition, she will discuss the various ways we as professionals can help combat it and advocate on behalf of our clients. A warm welcome, Dr. Kaufman. My name is Shiva, and I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by Anne, our committee's senior advisor, Neda, our marketing specialist, and Mena, our treasurer. Janan, my former co-chair, will be serving as the CPA diversity representative. Congratulations, Janan. Thank you for all you have done since 2020. And at this time, I would like to say thank you to our 2023 sponsors. With their financial support, we can sustain this seminar series. I'm going to share the slides with you, and you see the name of the donors here. At the platinum level, we have comprehensive neuropsychological services, and I'm so proud to say I'm a part of this company. And this company has helped us had helped us for the third consecutive year. Also, you see your names as supporters and friends. Thank you so much. I also would like to say thank you to the Connecticut Health Foundation for the grant they provided for us. And I would like to say special thanks to Anne, because Anne, you made it possible for us to have the grant and to improve the infrastructure of the Social Justice Committee. Now, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mena to provide you with additional information.
Hey everyone, on behalf of the Planning Committee, we're thrilled that you could join us this evening. And we hope that you continue to attend our future speaker sessions. The SJSS is in our second year of programming, and we're committed to combating racism, promoting, it's the third year of programming, and we're committed to combating racism, promoting community healing, social justice, and most notably being advocates for change. We're excited about the presentation from Dr. Kaufman. And as a quick reminder, the CPA SJSS offers free monthly meetings to CPA members, the broader Connecticut community, and our nationwide supporters. I welcome you to our speaker series for this evening, and now I'll turn it over to Anne to introduce our speakers.
Hi, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Caroline Kaufman. She's a postdoctoral fellow in the spirituality and mental health program at McLean Hospital and a clinical fellow in psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She earned her doctorate in clinical psychology with a child and adolescent psychology focus from the University of Memphis. She completed her clinical internship at Yale University in the Yale New Haven Hospital in their intensive outpatient program for adolescents and pediatric Yale Gender Program. Dr. Kaufman's research interests are at the intersection of spirituality, adversity, and mental health. She conceptualizes adversity broadly and is particularly interested in how spirituality may buffer against the impact of adversity on negative mental health outcomes. Her research also examines measurement of anti-Semitism in contemporary society and experimental settings. Dr. Kaufman is the program chair for the Division 36 Society for Psychology of Religion and Spirituality of the American Psychological Association and a member of their Social Justice Task Force. And she was highly recommended to us by our member, Dr. Ariel Rubenstein. So welcome today. We're so pleased to have you join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And I'm going to cross my fingers that this works. Thank you. Okay, it does work. Great. So thank you so much for that. Very warm welcome. My talk today is titled Anti-Semitism, Why Does It Happen and What to Do About It? And thank you so much for that introduction. I'm Dr. Caroline Kaufman. You can call me Caroline. I thought that I was going to have to tell you a little bit more about me as a researcher, but I got such a good introduction. I don't think I have to do that. I do want to provide a brief content warning. This presentation does include discussion of anti-Semitism and associated forms of racism, discrimination, and oppression. During the presentation today, there will be images that are anti-Semitic in nature and could be upsetting. So our objectives for today are as follows. First, to describe at least 3 modern manifestations of systemic and interpersonal anti-Semitism. 2, to explain at least 2 consequences of anti-Semitism and this phenomenon's relationship with other forms of prejudice in the United States. 3, describe how considerations of anti-Semitism may manifest in at least 1 each for diversity, justice, and equity informed spaces. And 4, identify 3 strategies to address systemic and interpersonal anti-Semitism. And I include this just to really focus our work today. Situating the researcher, you already know too much about me. I'll move on. When I talk about anti-Semitism, I like to give a little bit of background about my own perspective and approach to the study and discussion of anti-Semitism. And the first comes from Deborah Lipstadt. She's an internationally recognized Holocaust and Holocaust denial historian. And when talking about anti-Semitism, she says, it is hard, if not impossible, to explain something that is essentially irrational, delusional, and absurd. And as I hope you'll come to discover today, anti-Semitism as an ideology and way of thinking and way of seeing the world is irrational, delusional, and absurd. I may say things today and you'll think, well, Caroline, that doesn't make sense. You just said anti-Semitism says that. Well, exactly. The other quote I use to approach this issue is from a historian looking at anti-Semitism in the context of Jewish religious texts. And she says, it is not the job of the victims of violence or discrimination to explain the causes of the hatred that afflicts them or analyze their persecutors' motives. At a certain point, I don't think there's much utility in asking why this happens or if there are reasons behind it. It is not the job of Jews to explain why anti-Semitism exists. And you're here tonight with a Jew who's explaining why anti-Semitism exists. So I have my own personal experiences with anti-Semitism, both interpersonal, institutional, and also lived experience. Unfortunately, in 2019, my family's graves were desecrated in Fall River, Massachusetts, along with other dozens of graves in a Jewish cemetery. And I don't include this information to prevent people from providing dissenting opinions or pushing back against what I'm saying. I just provide it to provide more of my own context and approach to this work as someone who's experienced this interpersonally, institutionally. So let's talk about some terminology before we begin. Often when I give presentations like this, people ask me, Caroline, is it okay to say Jew? And yes, it is okay. It's appropriate also to say Jewish person or people of Jewish faith. If you're interested in learning about why it's okay to say Jew, there's a couple think pieces here. One was published, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, another in a blog. Jew is not a slur. It's not a bad thing. It's just a description. So let's begin also. We're in the Connecticut Psychological Association at this moment, but let's talk about APA, the American Psychological Association's definition of anti-Semitism. Okay, I hate to tell you this, there isn't one. It's missing. If you look in APA's dictionary, we do see 2 potentially relevant terms. And the first is describing the anti-Semitism scale, which is a scale I've used in my own research. And APA tells us it's a personality test that measures 5 aspects of anti-Semitism, including perceptions of Jews as personally offensive and socially threatening, hostile attitudes that suggest what should be done to Jews, and presumptions that Jews are too exclusive. So from there, we can maybe guess what APA's approach or definition of anti-Semitism is, but it's not necessarily clear. The second relevant definition or discussion of anti-Semitism coming from APA comes from the APA resolution on anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish prejudice. This was originally released in 2007, but I believe it was re-released in 2017 or 2018. And In that resolution, they describe anti-Jewish hostility, usually described or called anti-Semitism. But again, no specific definition of anti-Semitism from APA. And I think that leads us to a difficult point for those of us who are psychologists in the room. Where does that leave us when APA doesn't have a specific definition of this phenomenon? I think it might leave us in a difficult spot. So I'm going to provide a couple examples of definitions that you might use of anti-Semitism. The first comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, and they define anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, I think we're getting closer there. Another definition that I appreciate of anti-Semitism is hostile beliefs towards Jews as a collective, manifested in individuals as attitudes, in culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and image, and in actions, social or legal discrimination, political mobilization against Jews, and collective or state violence, which results in or is designed to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. If you read my own research, I actually use the International Holocaust Remembrance's definition of anti-Semitism because I've only recently come across this definition, which I like better. And I'll explain why. All of us may not be clinical psychologists in this room, but what I really like about this definition is that we see this triangle of cognitive aspects, behavioral aspects, and affective aspects of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism can manifest or be defined in terms of your beliefs, actions, or attitudes, and they all fit into this triangle of anti-Semitism. What I also really like about this definition is it, to some extent, incorporates Bronfenbrenner's approach, the bioecological model. Here we see discussion of anti-Semitism at the micro or individual level, the meso social group level, and also macro, meaning cultural or institutional level. And these are just to inform our work today. I'm not necessarily saying we have to ascribe to one throughout our discussion, but it's really just to focus us. So let's talk about examples of anti-Semitism. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, examples of anti-Semitism include calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or extremist view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as the power of Jews as a collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other social institutions, societal institutions. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. Accusing the Jews as a people or of Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. So who are Jews in our American context? Well, worldwide, they're 0.2% of the world's population. They are 0.2% of the world's population. This is an incredibly small group of people that we're talking about here. Approximately 1.8% of the US population is Jewish, less than 2%. And 20% of Jews in the United States self-describe as having no religion. 58% are college graduates, which is higher than the national average. 96% live in urban or suburban areas, again, higher than the national average. And 43% live in the Northeast. And around the world, 80%, most of the world's Jews, live in either the US or Israel. So now let's talk about how anti-Semitism operates. So broadly, there are several types of anti-Semitism, and they interlock, and sometimes I believe they're confusing to differentiate. But let's talk about three types here. The first is conspiracy theories. So these may be conspiracy theories that Jews have extraordinary access to wealth, power, control. A dog whistle or a way of referencing Jews in political rhetoric, indirectly, or some might say directly, is the word globalists. That Jews are out for global power. They look at the world globally. They have no national identity. That they are the cosmopolitan elite. That they are also capitalists and bankers, with, again, this incredible access to power and money, and that they are exerting control over the world. There are also conspiracy theories dating back for quite a long time about Jewish communist plots to take over government. Now, if I were listening to me talk here, I'd say, Caroline, but you just said that they were capitalists, according to conspiracy theories. Exactly. This is the problem with anti-Semitism, and this is why Deborah Lipstadt calls it absurd. Because on the one hand, Jews are wealthy capitalists out for profit, and then on the other, they're communists wanting to take down our markets. Again, Jewish conspiracy theories or about capitalist plots to control government and finance, and also conspiracy theories regarding the over-exaggeration or myth of the Holocaust. So the idea that either the Holocaust didn't happen, or that it might have happened, but it was on a much smaller scale than Jews currently allege, and that it's a conspiracy theory or conspiracy, this image of the Holocaust, to gain access to more power and privilege. And here are some examples of this conspiracy theory aspect of anti-Semitism. I hope it's not too small for your screen, but on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a depiction of a pig with several other pigs feeding from it, with the idea that Rothschild or Rothschild money is feeding both the UK, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the CIA, the State of Israel, and Boko Haram, a terrorist group in Nigeria. And again, we might see some contradictions here. It would be interesting that the Jews are funding both ISIS and the CIA, both Al-Qaeda and Israel, but that's a conspiracy theory. You'll see next to it, are you stunned by what has become of American culture? Well, it's not an accident. You've probably heard of cultural Marxism, but do you know what it means? And there's a picture of what appears to be like racist and anti-Semitic depiction of Jews, of people of color, promoting Marxism. On the lower left-hand corner, there is a picture of an anti-Semitic depiction of a man with 6 million, the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust, and crying on the world, and the world is saying, go away. There was an anti-Semitic slur originally in this cartoon that I decided to white out. I didn't think we needed it for our purposes. And here's a post from Twitter. Hitler was a Jew. I think the Holocaust or its results came from a civil war amongst Jews. That's the term Nazi party coming from Ashkenazi. You may or may not be familiar with the term Ashkenazi describing a specific group among Jewish identity. It doesn't come from the word Nazi. Hitler wasn't a Jew. But again, these are the kind of conspiracy theories that are out there being propagated about Jews. And if you look at violent instances of anti-Semitism, things like shootings, sometimes the individuals perpetrating those attacks reference these conspiracy theories. They do matter because there are people that believe them. So the second type of anti-Semitism we'll talk about is pseudo-biological theories. So this idea that Jews are dirty and spread disease, and this has been going back to medieval times, thinking that Jews poisoned wells and waters and communities that made people sick and resulted in the killing of Jews. The idea is that Jews are a separate and inferior race. So separate from other races and below. And this is from a white supremacist point of view. And also that Jews are smarter and more cunning than groups because they are a separate race. Again, you might say, Caroline, you just said they were inferior. And you would think that being more intelligent might not mean that. Exactly. This is absurd and delusional and contradicts itself. And yet it's still believed. So examples of this, the face Jews make when the Goyim know, all ills originate and emanate from the dual citizen Rothschild Zionists, fake Jew policies, laws, statutes, etc. from Israel that squat here for $20,000 a year salary. That Jews, we are cunning, we are devious, we are a separate race, we are below, and we are always out to get you. And then religious anti-Jewish beliefs, which I do see as separate from conspiracy and pseudo-biological theories. And this shows up as this idea that Jews might have killed Christ, that like Judas, who I believe was a Jew, Jews cannot be trusted and they'll betray anyone for money. In the New Testament, Judas betrays Christ for 30 pieces of silver, which leads to Christ's crucifixion, that we cannot be trusted, will betray you. And also there's this theory, I almost said conspiracy theory. You can see how these things weave together. There's this belief that Jews use blood in religious rituals. And this dates back to medieval times, beliefs and scares that Jews were killing children and taking their blood for religious rituals. I've been practicing a very long time as a Jew. I've yet to participate in an event that involved blood of any kind, much less blood from children. But we still see these show up. For instance, there was an event, I think in the last 2 years, where Catholic students at a Catholic school shouted, "You killed Jesus," at kids from a Jewish school who were playing in what should have been a really fun basketball game. This shows up. So when thinking about how anti-Semitism manifests and how it operates, you might notice these contradictory points that I'm making and wonder, how could this all have occurred at the same time? Well, Weiss is a thinker. She wrote a book about anti-Semitism. She argues that Jews are transformed into whatever society hates most. We can see that throughout history, that it shows up often when something is a problem, something like wells being poisoned or communist threats, that yes, Jews are blamed. There are some stable stereotypes about Jews that are negative. And I do think Weiss's quote here is pretty helpful to think about how anti-Semitism shows up and how it operates. It's not the fault of Jews. It's not what we've done or what we've been doing, but it might be what is plaguing society at that time. So I'd like to show, this may sound repetitive to you, but again, I'd really like to show how these anti-Semitic beliefs conflict and all somehow exist within the same ideology of anti-Semitism. So the first belief, and we see this more now recently in the turn of the 21st century, that Jews are a globally entitled white group. So that all Jews are white, and that as a result of their white identity, they have special access to power and privilege. Another anti-Semitic view is that Jews are an inferior race. So while some individuals contend that Jews are white, and not only white, but an extra kind of white, white supremacist groups maintain that Jews are not white and are actually an inferior race. And this goes back many generations. This idea of Jews having special powers, whether that be intelligence, money-making, cunning, being able to fool or deceive, Jews as controlling the majority culture, whether that's media. We heard very recently from a very famous rapper concerns that Jews were controlling Hollywood and the music business. This idea that Jews are always working in secrecy, behind the scenes, the puppet masters, if you will. But also this idea that Jews are always working in plain sight, controlling things. This idea of Jews being oppressors, of discriminating against, pushing down, silencing voices. And at the same time, Jews as playing the victim. How can these all exist at the same time in the same ideology? Well, it's delusional, irrational, and inaccurate, but they do all exist at the same time. And again, people believe them. And at certain times, people's belief of this ideology causes violence, deadly violence. One last time, I'm going to really hone in this point here. Anti-Semitism has these two conflicting pieces in the same ideology. The perception of Jews as superior, the most white, the most privileged, the least oppressed, the most elite, and also the idea of Jews as inferior, Jews as subhuman, non-white, dirty, and beneath other races and religious groups. Now, this image isn't meant to suggest that being white is superior or better. This is merely coming from the white supremacist perspective and their way of viewing the world. That's why I'm showing this up here. So an example of this, there was an anti-Semitic conspiracy that Jews came up with the coronavirus shot, the COVID vaccine, that it could harm you, that there was something wrong with it. And also this idea that Jews came up with and caused COVID and have spread it to people and made them sick. And again, these two things you wouldn't think can exist at the same time, and yet they do. So there's just a couple anti-Semitic myths that I'd like to just take a minute to point out may not be true. I can't do that for all of them. I don't know how I could prove to you or someone else that Jews aren't dirty, even by showing you the amount of money Jews spend on soap or anything like that. But here's a couple things I can say. So worldwide, only 1.7% of millionaires are Jews. That's worldwide. 56.2% are Christian, 6.5% are Muslim, and 3.9% are Hindu. Between 8 and 20% of American Jews are not white or European American. And that number is different in other parts of the world, places like France, Israel, Morocco, other places. But in the United States, up to 20% of American Jews may not be white or European American. In fact, 15% of Jews under 30 are not white or European American. And also 20% of Jewish households in the US have incomes less than $30,000. Now, this statistic doesn't tell us if there are children in the house, how many children are in the house, but I include this statistic to show that these beliefs of outsized wealth and elite lifestyle is not true. So let's talk about how anti-Semitism can manifest beyond these conspiracy theories on Twitter. So it can manifest in a variety of forms. Checking my time there. Microaggressions, so those are interpersonal, intimidation, bomb threats, which we've seen in Jewish community centers, vandalism, simple assault, aggravated assault, and shootings. Anti-Semitism can be deadly. So there was some really great work from Hodge and Body that came out in 2021, talking about common anti-Semitic microaggressions and sort of explaining why they might be microaggressions and what are the implicit messages behind those things. And I'd like to talk about that with you. The first, it's an interpersonal microaggression, sanctioning anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. Examples like saying, oh, you're Jewish, you must be good with money. Or saying that that store is owned by Jews, you won't get a fair deal there. And that first one might sound like something positive, and yet it could be experienced as a microaggression. In fact, people say it to me quite often. And the message from that kind of statement is that Jews can be reduced to derogatory stereotypes and that Jews are dishonest. Pathologizing Jewish spirituality, it's interpersonal, stating that's insane after learning about Jewish practices and rituals. And the message from that is Jewish beliefs represent a form of mental illness. There's something wrong with them. Assuming uniformity among the Jewish population, this is interpersonal. I believe this shows up in DEI settings quite often. Asking, what is the Jewish perspective on the President Biden, meaning President Biden? And the message there is that there is no diversity of thought among Jews, that Jews are all the same, that all think and believe and exist the same way, which isn't true. This other one, you have red hair. Are you sure you're Jewish? Again, a message. Everyone within Judaism is the same. Now, I think this microaggression regarding red hair is particularly concerning because it accidentally, I've had many people say things like this to me, and I know they don't mean it with malicious intent. But where it comes from, again, is that Jews are a race, that they all look the same, that they have the same physical stereotypes, and that you can identify them easily when there is great diversity among who Jews are and what Jews look like. Everyone within Judaism is not the same. Exoticizing Jewish spirituality. That's an interpersonal microaggression. So excessive questions about bar mitzvah, circumcision, or other practices. Oh, I have a chat. I just want to check it. Someone said, I get it all the time. You don't look Jewish. It's infuriating. It is infuriating and incorrect. So these excessive questions, the message is your beliefs are alien. There's a very small Larry David on the right side of the screen, and he's saying, people love when you ask them about what they're doing. I respect that Hodge and Body identified this as an interpersonal microaggression. I think it's difficult. Excessive questions may be a microaggression, and microaggressions really depend on someone's experience, the impact. And when I think about this suggested microaggression, I do think about what mistake would I rather make? Asking somebody about their traditions and identity and trying to learn more about them, or not asking and not taking a moment to learn or give someone space or tell me about who they are. I would argue it is okay to ask questions about religious traditions, experiences, and identities. Hodge and Body do quantify this a little bit by saying excessive. I don't know where the line for excessive is, but when I think about suggestions like this, I think about what mistake would I rather make? Asking or not asking? Exoticizing Jewish spirituality can also be staring, particularly Jews wearing a yarmulke or a kippah, or perhaps women wearing a wig or covering their hair. And the message there, even if inadvertent, is you are outside mainstream society. You're different. Denying the existence of anti-Semitism, interpersonal. I also see this show up in DEI settings. Oh, DEI meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jews can experience bias. They are rich, they are powerful, they are politically connected, and they're all white. Message: your understanding of reality is inferior of my understanding of your reality. I've got it right. Disparaging Jewish spirituality. This is an environmental microaggression. Labels that depict Jews as fundamentalists, desecrating the Star of David. And the message is that you as a Jew are a bigot, you're hateful, and Jews should be prohibited. People ask about intention in terms of like this excessive question. I think that shows up. What the literature right now in microaggressions talks about is intent versus impact. And impact is very, very important. So if I'm asking questions that are making someone feel othered, small, or in some way bad, I don't want to do that. And I think intent can be important too. And if you're asking with the best of intent, when someone explains to you what the actual impact is, I think it's easier to hear that. So assuming secularism as the normative view. So textbooks that depict secular accounts by omitting the contributions of Jewish people, featuring their contributions, but failing to mention they are Jewish. So depicting them as secular. There are famous Jews who've contributed to our society. We don't know them as Jewish. We don't know about their religious traditions, but somehow we know that JFK is Catholic. This message that we see in textbooks and other settings when we omit people's Jewish identity or their religious practices is that Jews do not exist. Television shows that feature secular characters without representation of identifiable Jews. Sometimes you see this in certain movies where a character is supposed to be Jewish and takes on certain mannerisms or stereotypes, trying to communicate to the audience that they're Jewish without any religious practices. And also lack of depiction of religious or observant Jews. And the message there is that observant and or identifiable Jews are outside the mainstream of society. So here's some additional, what I call everyday anti-Semitism. So faculty, committee, community, and other events and meetings scheduled on Friday nights, Saturday mornings, and Jewish holidays. There was a social justice task force event that I was asked to speak at that was during a Jewish holiday when I'm in synagogue. And I've yet to be asked to go to a committee meeting or a faculty meeting on Christmas, on Easter, or even on a Sunday morning. We can't schedule events on those days. For people who don't know much about Judaism, typically the observant time for observant Jews is from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown. So individuals may not be able to present at conferences, to attend faculty dinners on Friday nights, or other events, maybe even on Saturday mornings. Also, I know it's so easy to do, but there's often talk of Christmas parties in our departments in December. Or what are you going to do for the Easter holiday? Or even putting in your syllabus, Easter holiday, if you're not at a religious institution. These behaviors are so easy to do, and they do accidentally point out a prioritization of a certain group and certain religion. Lack of focus on Jews and issues related to Jews in multicultural research literature. You can see these citations below. This is noted in the field that if you look at multicultural research literature, Jews are seriously under-examined and under-included, as well as comparatively little scholarship on anti-Semitism as compared to other forms of racism, discrimination, and prejudice. It's under-examined. And also, Holocaust denial and or minimization. That is an example of everyday anti-Semitism. Just want to take a look at the chat real quick. Oh, thank you. Sure. So let's talk about rates of anti-Semitism. This is for the United States. Unfortunately, we've seen since, 2013, a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. 2013, we had about 751 incidents. In 2021, over 2,000 incidents. And I want to remind you again, Jews only make up 2% of the United States population. And hate crimes that target Jewish communities made up more than half of the religious-based hate crimes in 2021. Jews are overrepresented in hate crime statistics. Ariel says, Caroline, are you going to address Israel? I feel like this is the theme of most of the anti-Semitism I experience. Ariel, just wait, buckle up. Amy said, yes, I experience invisibility as anti-Semitism. Yeah. So some research was done asking Jews what kind of anti-Semitism they experienced in the past year. You'll see in one part of the circle or pie chart here, 15% of Jews included in this survey said they didn't experience any anti-Semitism. Not one bit in the last year, but 85% did. 20% said they were made to feel unwelcome. 15% they said they were called offensive names or a name. 8% received online harassment. 5% were physically attacked or threatened. And 37% experienced vandalism or graffiti of some kind. What are the consequences of anti-Semitism? Well, when you ask Jews how much anti-Semitism is there in the United States, 45% say a lot. And this is rising, by the way. 47% say none, or some, excuse me, and 8% say other, so maybe a little or none. When you ask Jews how has the amount of anti-Semitism changed in the last 5 years, 76% say more anti-Semitism in the last 5 years. Now there is 5% that says less and almost 20% that says the same amount. Even if anti-Semitism isn't something that's affected you, or maybe you have some hesitation about how important this issue is, we're seeing that Jews are telling us it's important. In fact, we're seeing that 54% of Jews are saying they feel less safe today than they did 5 years ago. And this is specifically referring to their identity as Jews, not just the general crime or environment. 43% though do feel just as safe, and 3% feel safer. I know people are raising their hands. Oh, does anti-Semitism vary significantly by region in the United States? So what we do see is that the simple assault and aggravated assault as manifestations of anti-Semitism are more common in areas with a large Jewish population, and particularly New York City. There's a very large population of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews that unfortunately experience simple and aggravated assaults more than we would like. So what are the consequences of anti-Semitism? Well, we know from research, you can see all those citations there, experiences of anti-Semitic discrimination are associated with poor quality of life, and exposure to anti-Semitic speech, discrimination, and events are associated with anxiety and depression, distress, loss of dignity, feelings of marginalization, higher stress, and lower life satisfaction. Anti-Semitism has real consequences. Someone said more from the right or the left. Both. It just shows up differently. And just to remind you, the consequences of anti-Semitism are very real. They can result in loss of life, in injury, in damage. So how does anti-Semitism show up in diversity, equity, inclusion spaces, equity, diversity, and inclusion spaces, and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion spaces? In DEI and multicultural spaces, Jews are often seen as marginal, but not marginalized. And marginal can mean a lot of things. And that's this quote comes from Bedell, who reported or wrote a book called Jews Don't Count in 2019. And the whole premise of his book is that in DEI spaces, Jews do not count because they are marginal, but not marginalized, according to cultural views. In many cases, Jews may not be welcomed or recognized in DEI and multicultural spaces. There might not be outreach to Jews to be participants in those groups. There may not be initiatives that include them. And we see this in the field. No real discussion of Jews is present in any capacity in several prominent books in the field of multicultural education. What helps me build empathy is that I think about that many people were not trained to think about anti-Semitism or to consider Jewish identity as part of DEI or multiculturalism. And so, of course, when they go to build a DEI committee or a multicultural initiative, they don't think to include Jews. But this is a problem. There's also, someone asked about the left and the right. There's concerns typically from the right and the far right that Jews are behind multicultural and DEI initiatives, that we are behind cultural and social movements like Black Lives Matter purposely to try and disrupt or detract from society in some way. And while Jews may be involved in many social justice initiatives, we are not the mastermind of them, especially when sometimes we find ourselves unwelcome in those spaces. And here's where I feel that anti-Semitism gets really, really difficult in DEI spaces. There's this perception, again, that Jews benefit from white supremacy and that Jews benefit from the status quo. Why? Because we have this outsized access to wealth, power, and privilege, which is an anti-Semitic belief. In addition, what we've already talked about today is that not all Jews are white. And in fact, there are very good books about this. There's a book called How Jews Became White Folks, that Jews were not considered white in the United States until after World War II. So to be in a DEI space and not only be told what your identity is, that you are white, that you benefit from white privilege when white supremacists don't like you, and also to have parents or grandparents who were told growing up that they were not white, is a difficult experience. I'm looking at the chat. In terms of anti-Semitism in liberal spaces, my son cannot publicly associate with Hillel, Chabad on his college campus because those kids are or are accused of being racist, anti-Palestinian. So he meets with the Chabad rabbi privately, doesn't engage as much as he'd like to. As a first-generation survivor, I struggle with the debate about whether it's anti-Semitic to have deep concerns about Israel's relationship with the Palestinians in particular. We are extraordinarily diverse, and my family, both here in Israel, believe that diversity is very apparent. Very interested in your thoughts. It is possible to critique Israel in a way that is not anti-Semitic. And I sometimes find the Israel debate difficult, or discussion difficult in DEI spaces, because I notice that my other friends of ethnic and racial identities that are associated with a certain country or part of the world are not asked to speak upon and defend a country that they are not from. I'm not Israeli. I'm an American Jew. Excuse me. I think it's definitely possible to have debates, deep discussions, difficult discussions about Israel and its role as a country. I think to accuse Israel or call Israel Nazi Germany or equate them to Hitler or Nazis is anti-Semitic. I think to hold Israel to a certain standard that we don't hold other countries is problematic. Oh, someone's talking. No? Okay. Someone said, are you able to comment on what seems like a significant discrepancy? My impression is that the last Republican administration was perceived as supporting Israel, but the same administration did not condemn demonstrators who chanted, Jews will not replace us. Yeah, there's some discussion. If you look, the Trump administration released a statement about being Jewish as being a nationality, which some people found to be very protective and made them feel good that the government was recognizing Jews as a potentially vulnerable group. And also identifying Jews as a nationality, again, goes back to this age-long stereotype that Jews have dual citizenship, they have dual loyalties, and they are never loyal to the country that they are in. They are always most loyal to Jews, or in the current context, most loyal to Israel. I know a lot of people are equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism automatically without any context. Of course, sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're not. I think that's true. Do these numbers account for that at all? So what you'll see in the psych research when we look at anti-Semitism is it does correlate with anti-Zionism, that there's a statistically significant correlation there, and it's not one-to-one. So for instance, someone that expresses concerns to you or views that are anti-Zionist does not inherently mean that they are an anti-Semite or have anti-Semitic views. However, I think it's worth thinking about how we express our views and making sure that we're doing so in a way that isn't denigrating, going after, or scapegoating a certain group of people. So how else? I see the chat blowing up. Just let me get through this slide. How does anti-Semitism show up? Lack of inclusion in training, education, and funding efforts. Endowed chairs, fellowships, and scholarships for anti-Semitism. Very difficult to find. I see purposeful or accidental silencing of Jewish voices because they are perceived to represent the privileged majority and or oppressive whiteness. Again, this belief that Jews are white, that Jews have this inordinate access to power and wealth. So we need to silence those voices, to quiet them. They've already had their say. And I say, how else? Some people already said in the chat to me, I feel invisible. In the chat, I see people saying anti-Zionism has become another form of anti-Semitism. Most of the time, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's so rare to see anti-Zionists who hold that standard to other countries. To be honest, I'm not an expert on international politics. I'm a psychologist. And there are times when anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism show up in the same space. And I think there are times when criticism of Israel shows up that is not anti-Semitic in nature. I've been thinking in the back of my head about the comment about someone's son who has to meet with his Chabad rabbi in private. The intent may not be anti-Semitic, but if the impact is that someone cannot practice their religion or consult with their religious leader, I think unfortunately, the impact appears to be anti-Semitic. It's saying Israel is not entitled to exist as opposed to objecting to some of their policies. I have some questions here. Oh no, I think I answered them. Just kidding. Okay. So what can be done? What can be done? Well, I have some recommendations, and a lot of these come from Singer in an article published in 2022. In the educational or teaching setting, what we need to do is provide multicultural education that includes.
Unfortunately.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone say something? Oh, okay. Multicultural education that includes Jewish identity and anti-Semitism in multicultural and anti-racist courses, articles, and books. We've already talked about how it's underrepresented in this context and it affects the next generation, and we need to include it. We also need to include an expansion of Jewish identity, the way that we talk about it, beyond the Holocaust. I went to Catholic school growing up, believe it or not, and we did have a Learn About Jews week, and all we talked about was the Holocaust. And Jews are much, much more than the Holocaust, have existed long before and will exist long after. And this comes from a quote in research. If I were a non-Jewish kid, I really wouldn't know anything about Jewish people other than the fact that so many died in the Holocaust, which is just an unfortunate way of looking at things. And I agree, it is unfortunate. There are many other things about being Jewish that are interesting and important to learn about. I think I messed up my spacing here, but this should be a third recommendation. Avoid viewing Jewishness and Jews as a monolith. There is great intersectionality among Jews. 25% of American Jews identify as LGBTQ+. And again, up to 20% of American Jews may be people of color. There's great intersection there. In educational settings, we have a responsibility to critically analyze and repudiate conspiracy theories about Jews. And the first is the basic recognition that the Holocaust happened. The only thing I won't debate, I won't argue about, much like Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust historian, is whether or not the Holocaust happened. It happened. We need to deny anti-Semitic myths and tropes in our classes and discussions. And we need to include facts that confront anti-Semitic beliefs. And this is important in general for conspiracy theories. We see that in research, conspiracy theories about Jewish power are correlated with overall conspiratorial thinking and other kinds of conspiracies. So from my perspective, when you're confronting conspiracy theories in general or conspiracy theories about Jews, you're also trying to get at conspiracy theories in general. You're feeding two birds with one scone. In education settings, we need to think about how we schedule exams, meetings, and extra credit opportunities. I can't tell you about how many times I've had to ask for special permission from a dean or a chair of a department to reschedule an exam that was scheduled on a Jewish holiday. We also need to avoid scheduling on Friday nights and Saturday mornings. I know this can be a really easy time for a lot of people to meet, especially at conferences, and our Jewish colleagues, and especially our observant colleagues, may not be able to attend. And this, by the way, is true for other religious traditions we need to be mindful of. So in our clinical practice, someone asked me, people like dead Jews. Yes, from Horn, right? I've met her. She's wonderful. People Like Dead Jews is a really, really good book. Thank you for recommending that. Wondering if you're referring to some African-American community developing anti-Semitic Oh, Darahorn, thanks. Attitudes. Oh, yes. And thanks, Ariel. Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism is something that I'm a part of. And I think, Ariel, you are too, which can be very helpful. So in our clinical practice, we need to, I'm sorry, y'all, I'm really trying to watch time here, to have basic education about Jewish communities, beliefs, and traditions. We can never fully experience what I call cultural competence. I'm Jewish. I'll never know everything about Jews. But to meet our Jews with cultural humility and what background knowledge we can have. We also need to recognize our internal bias, that we may engage in anti-Semitic microaggressions, that we may have unchecked stereotypes about Jews, that we may accidentally characterize Jewish clients in a way that's anti-Semitic. As an example, when I was in graduate school, we were watching a tape of a client and my supervisor said, well, I don't really like his like neurotic, elite, fast talking New York style. And I looked around the room. I was the only Jewish person in the room. I knew that because I knew these people. And I knew what she was saying. She was saying Jewish. Now, when I ask you to think about your internal bias, I'm also speaking to Jews too. We may have certain beliefs about ourselves as a community or individuals that may not help our clients and may accidentally come from anti-Semitic stereotypes in history. And the same way we want to do this with our anti-Semitic bias, we want to do with our other biases for all groups. And this is work you can do all at the same time. In clinical practice, we need to have awareness of holiday decorations. December and spring can be such a wonderful holiday time for many of us. And we may be accidentally telling our clients, we don't see you. We don't recognize you. You're not welcome here. And also a willingness to listen to and give credence to lived experience of anti-Semitism. We do see from people that they say that people don't believe them, especially in DEI spaces, or say that it's not true, that's not anti-Semitic. We need to listen. Now, what we see in the research literature is that Jewish clients may have potential and I think understandable distrust of non-Jewish therapists. If you're someone who's not Jewish working with a Jewish client, you notice that lack of trust, to just approach it in a culturally humble and warm stance over time. We also want to avoid pathologizing Jewish religiosity. It can be called obsessive and scrupulous. And I think that these are terms we need to take out of our vocabulary, especially when these come from religious beliefs and traditions. If you're interested in trying to learn how to differentiate scrupulosity from obsessive compulsive disorder among Jews, I would refer you to David Rosmarin. He's my mentor and he works at McLean Hospital. Also, we might see something we might call healthy paranoia among Jews. We know from the Holocaust experiences and other experiences that there's an intergenerational transmission of trauma, which may lead people to view that the world is dangerous and that they have this healthy paranoia. And it is not for us as therapists to tell them that they're wrong for that or that it's ill-founded. My research recommendations, oh no, my spacing got messed up, is the inclusion of anti-Semitism and Jewish identity in grantsmanship, calls for papers, special issues, and research initiatives. It must be included, and it's not. Also fellowships, so people can spend time developing expertise and doing research in this area. We also need to include Jews in multicultural initiatives, DEI committees, task forces. And we need to expand research examining the experience and effects of anti-Semitism. There's very little out there comparatively. I think we should do work looking at the causes of anti-Semitism and associated forms of prejudice. And again, I don't think we'll ever be able to explain something that's fundamentally irrational. We do need more research looking at associations between anti-Semitism and health outcomes. We know from the minority stress model that for many groups, experiences of discrimination and oppression are associated with poor health outcomes. We need this work among Jews. My final thought before I really start looking at the chat here is that all isms and forms of prejudice are connected. So when you are fighting homophobia and transphobia, you're fighting anti-Semitism. When you are fighting racism, you're fighting anti-Semitism. And the same goes for sexism, ableism, classist mentalities. You are fighting it all. They're all interconnected. So if you're doing that work, thank you. You're fighting anti-Semitism. So I would like to say thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to y'all. Really, we've addressed some of the recommendations I have today by providing an opportunity for education, and you've done that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the chat here. I'm sighing because I'm seeing in the chat people talking about their experiences with anti-Semitism. There's a group forming in New Haven to fight the anti-Semitism caused by DEI ideology in education. That's very interesting. Yale does have a center for the study of anti-Semitism, and they do free lessons and webinars. I would encourage anyone to learn about that. It's really from sometimes a philosophical perspective, but it's very interesting. And so what I might do, and I might need the help of my panelists, is to help me understand. I do see that we're already over time, but if we do or don't have time for additional questions, then I'd love to answer those, but also deferring to our leaders here.
Can we respond at least 2 questions?
And what we can do is, for those who need the CE and who need to get off, please, we understand that. You can do that. We put a link to for the CE link for those who need continuing education credits. And thank you for joining us. And we're really grateful that Dr. Kaufman can stay on longer and answer a few more questions for those who have time to stay on.
So I see one topic about Yale looks at historical anti-Semitism, not contemporary anti-Semitism. I've seen, maybe I'm missing it, but I've seen more presentations of contemporary anti-Semitism recently, particularly around Israel. So if that's a concern or interest, that might be a really good place to go, because they do have that expertise and I don't. Oh, they're hosting her in March. Oh, she's great. Y'all got to go. She's really, really wonderful. I see internalized anti-Semitism. And that really should have been a recommendation for clinical practice, is that you may see clients with aspects of internalized anti-Semitism. And that can be challenging to deal with as a Jewish therapist, or I think in some ways even more as a non-Jewish therapist. How can we invite non-Jewish clinicians to learn about this? It often feels like mostly Jewish people attend. Yeah, I think the way that we do that is by continuing to argue that Jewish identity is part of multiculturalism and diversity, and that all prejudice isms are combined. And that, again, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're talking about racism, we're talking about homophobia and transphobia, we're talking about genocide. And when we do that, we are really working for everybody. The only thing we have to lose is our chains.
And Caroline, I just want to say this was phenomenal. I'm someone that has kind of grown up in a very unique culture where my parents come from Iran, and I'm half Muslim, half Jewish, and according to Islam, I'm Muslim, and according to Judaism, I'm Jewish. This comes from my mom's side, but both my parents have been mostly agnostic all their lives, and we've probably been to more churches than anything else, just because there's more churches around, and it doesn't make a difference where they pray as long as they pray. And one of the things that I think is something that may be causing many people not to attend sessions like this is, I think that oftentimes people are scared to talk about some of the hard topics, such as Israel, right? Where they feel like if I bring that up, they're going to assume that I'm engaging in anti-Semitism. If I ask those questions, they're going to start they feel uncomfortable and so they don't have those conversations. And one thing I've learned in my experience is that exposure is so important. And the more times people get exposed to each other and they get close enough that they can kind of have those conversations in a genuine way where they meet someone who is Jewish, who disagrees with some of the things that the Israeli government is doing, but yet, you know, helps others to kind of have those conversations about the difference between being Jewish and supporting everything that a particular government does, because that's not necessarily that's not synonymous. And that is kind of a way to get individuals outside to kind of get more interested if we have sessions that kind of highlight that, where they're realizing there are ways to have discussions, and instead of just not having them, you know, what are the ways that people can have those conversations? And so I'm glad that some of those comments kind of came up, because I think it is really valuable and important for participants to kind of get a sense of how they can have these conversations in a healthy manner and realize that there is a distinction, right? Not necessarily as clear, but there is.
Certainly. Someone asked, I have Jewish clients who frequently make anti-Semitic comments to me, a Jewish psychologist. I'm not sure how to respond to these comments. Well, first, I would encourage you to do what you're most comfortable with. But for me, I typically ask, what do you mean by that? How do you think I might take that? Here's how that sits with me. And I see someone's hand is raised, but I don't really know how to respond to that person.
Yes, because we cannot hear people. So would you
I can
please
allow
Okay.
someone to speak. Do you have the name?
I think it's Steven Sarfati.
Thanks for doing an extraordinary job just analytically laying out on its full face anti-Semitism. And at the same time, the astounding juxtaposition of the fundamental intersectionality of all of the madness for everybody. And how you put that together is so important. And I just want to say, it also strikes me as where the conversation of this whole series kind of has been pointing to, as everyone comes in and one way or another, their lived experience is so fundamentally present and well documented, and that intersectionality still is left somehow inescapable. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So do you think we can do the closing remarks? So Dr. Kaufman, we do appreciate your talk, the awareness you create among us. Thank you so much.
Alrighty, so I'm going to, let me just make you go, can hear me great. So I'm going to share my screen. And I know for many of you, are hungry or tired or have kids. So we're going to kind of finish up. And so we just wanted to thank you for joining us this evening. Our next social justice event will be on February 23rd. Dr. Leaf will present findings on Black mothers' racial socialization practices with their daughters on racial violence. I want to end by mentioning that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series is through fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you are able to support, the donation link is in the chat, or is going to be put in the chat. I also would like to invite you to complete our evaluation link, which is now being added to the chat. Your responses will help us improve future sessions. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month.